So every once in a while, I come across a new recording technique that sounds so different and is so novel from everything I've seen in the past that it just kind of stops me in my tracks. So I thought it could be cool to lay out 4 different techniques that are either going to make your mixes sound very different from how they are now. One of them is a mixing technique that was a complete breakthrough for me that completely changed my mixes, or just stuff that makes your life easier. You'll see all 4 of them are a little bit different, cover different sort of things, but all of them were huge for me. Number 1, the guitar tones from Neutral Milk Hotel. If you're familiar with Neutral Milk Hotel, you'll know just how huge and biting their guitar tones are. They fill out the entire sonic image of the song with acoustic guitars, distorted acoustic guitars. Sometimes when I show people these tracks, they assume that my speakers are clipping because of how lo-fi and gritty these guitar tones are.
2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
But here's how you make it. Take your acoustic guitar, preferably one that has a pickup in it. If you don't have a pickup, mic up your acoustic guitar and do all of this in post. And run your acoustic guitar DI into your audio interface, preferably with a guitar pedal, some overdrive or fuzz in between the two. Okay, so I've been experimenting with the hardware that we're going to use to make this Neutral Milk Hotel sound. I already built the software chain, sounding pretty good to my ears. So all we're doing is we're taking my Taylor, we are running it through my pedal board. Here is my exact overdrive settings. This is the treble, this is the mid-range, this is the bass. So tons of bass, not a lot of treble, and plenty of mid-range too. This is the drive and the volume. We have a decent amount of overdrive, and then all of that is going into the interface direct. Now bear in mind, these are probably not the techniques that they use to get this tone, but we're using more modern techniques in order to do it. Set the preamp really hot. If you have analog preamps, don't be afraid to clip your signal. But if you're like most of us and don't have analog preamps, Analog Obsession is a free plugin company. They have amazing vintage preamp emulators, and I'll be using that. Use that preamp plugin and artificially clip the signal. I would also add compression at this step too, plenty of compression. Now quick tip, be mindful of feedback if you're doing this technique. This is an acoustic guitar after all. The goal here is to take that acoustic guitar's notoriously high dynamic range and squash it down with a bunch of distortion. And we're using as many different techniques as possible to distort that signal. Pedal distortion, preamp distortion, compression. We're throwing the kitchen sink at this acoustic guitar. And it is probably very uncomfortable because it's an acoustic and it's like, what are you doing to me? This type of signal also occupies most of the sonic information, all the way down from the lows to the high end. If you just take 2 different takes, one hard on the left and one hard on the right, you have got a massive guitar tone that really doesn't need any other overdubs. Number 2, St. Vincent reverb tails. So I'm ripping this technique straight from one of my favorite albums, that's one of my favorite productions from one of my favorite artists and one of my favorite producers. The album is Strange Mercy by St. Vincent and the producer is John Congleton. The basic idea is to use automation lanes to cut the volume of the reverb tails on the downbeat of the groove. And this technique is all over the record, but if you need a really prominent, obvious example, listen to the song Dilettante. There's plenty of sonic space in that song, so you can hear these backing vocal reverbs really, really well.
Oh, Elijah, don't make me wait.
So the intuitive thing to do for really reverby backing vocals that are kind of ephemeral and ambient is to let them trail off into the mix, right? This really defies listeners' expectations by turning those reverb tails into a rhythmic instrument. So let's take a bunch of oohs and ahs that are all around the stereo image and put them to a backing beat. Then, whenever we see fit according to the groove of the song, let's take those reverbs from whatever volume they happen to be at and cut them directly down to 0. Okay, so to kind of exhibit how you would do this, I pulled up a track that I'm working on. The clip that I showed of Dilettante is a much better example of this technique in action, but I can show you the mechanics here. So check this out. I have the bass, the backing vocals, and the drums on right now, and you can hear what's happening, and I'll explain it afterwards. So obviously I kind of drenched it in reverb, I drenched it in delay, lots of feedback in order to kind of have that tail, but it really is just a matter of turning the speaker on, turning the plugin on, using automation. So if you don't know what that looks like in Ableton, it's pretty simple. If you look at this group here, which I will name backing vocals, we have a mixer, and then we have plugins that I have on the chain, which you can also see down here. One of them is Megaverb, one of them is Repeater. Repeater is a delay, Megaverb is a reverb, and then we have the mixer, which just controls general volume and a few other parameters. If it has a red dot on it, that means it's being automated using automation. So you can see here on mixer, speaker on, you can see right whenever the kick hits, which is this clip here, we are turning off the mixer volume. We are also on Megaverb turning off the device itself, and on the repeater, the delay, we are also turning off the device. Back in. Here's the lead vocal on top of everything.
And it feels unfair. All the pain we share.
And don't forget that this doesn't just have to apply to backing vocals. You could use this on really ambient guitars, ambient keys, pads, whatever. But even further, you could use this technique for something that isn't volume automation. Let's say like a really glitchy, angry, fuzzed out guitar, but then instantly it turns into a really clean ambient guitar out of nowhere. It really kind of opens up Pandora's box. It's a very simple concept, but very effective. Number 3, the $15 rubber bridge. So a lot of you might already know this one from my Phoebe Bridgers video. If you haven't watched that video, it's one of my favorite ones I've ever made, you should. But had I known that it would take off and basically sell out of the entire product on the internet, which is really cool, but I probably would have fleshed out my explanation a little bit more. By the way, I didn't invent this, this was recommended to me. But for those who don't know, a rubber bridge is a permanent modification to your guitar. Not only that, but it is an incredibly popular trope in today's music. This kind of folk revival from Taylor Swift, Phoebe Bridgers, Bon Iver, Noah Kahan now, that whole crowd, it's a very, very desired tone in today's music. But the only problem is it's a permanent modification. So you have to pay like $150 in order to change your acoustic guitar forever. Now there are a lot of non-permanent solutions to this tone, like a rubber tube that you might be able to stick under your strings, or a rubber band that you wrap around your strings, padding your guitar with tissue, a bunch of different kind of stuff. But I never found these techniques to be particularly accurate, and who wants to play a show with tissues sticking out of their guitar? But so this is a tennis racket string de-vibrator, and watch this. The spacing happened to work out pretty well for me. You can just stick them onto the strings like that, and the slots that are normally for a tennis racket makes a rubber bridge guitar, and it's really accurate sounding. You could play it on stage and you won't get weird looks or anything like that, and it just sounds so much better. And it costs around 10 to 15 bucks depending on where you buy it. But had I known that it would catch on as much as it has with the TikTok videos and stuff like that, I would have also came with a few warnings. Namely, the string spacing isn't quite perfect for a guitar, especially depending on the guitar you have. For my Taylor and my neck width, it happened to work out pretty well. It didn't put too much pressure on the outside strings. But for guitars that have smaller, thinner necks, your string spacing is going to be a lot more cramped, and it's going to be harder for that vibrakill to sit on top of, especially when it comes to the low E and the high E. And this is where you might need to modify the Babolat a little bit for your specific guitar. Take a knife and on the low E string and on the high E string, make a small incision a few millimeters deep. Then test it on your guitar and keep doing that until it fits properly. Regardless, the tone to me is nearly identical to a rubber bridge guitar, and it won't involve a $150 modification job that you can never get rid of. Number Number 4, Andrew Scheps and the rear bus. So recently I was asked a really interesting mixing question. The question was, what's the newest technique that you've learned that blew your mind and changed how you mixed forever? Shout out to Fran, by the way. She asked me the question. Go follow her on Instagram. She has crazy cool indie music. And here was my answer. While studying mixing techniques by Andrew Scheps for my Hosier video, you should go watch that video if you haven't, because it is my favorite video that I've ever made. Andrew outlined something called the rear bus. If you don't know Andrew Scheps, he's an incredibly accomplished audio engineer, and he's worked with a ton of famous artists. We're talking like Red Hot Chili Peppers, Lana Del Rey, and like Black Sabbath. And he's known for using a lot of parallel processing in his mix. Parallel processing essentially amounts to making a more extreme effect in parallel with the unprocessed track and mixing them together. Like a super compressed track that's really loud but maybe doesn't have the dynamics and natural sound of the original track. Mix them to taste and get the best of both worlds. That's all parallel processing is. So where myself and others may have a parallel processing chain for the vocals and one for the drums, maybe one for the guitars if we need to, Andrew Scheps has an additional parallel send called the rear bus. Let's go to the DAW in order to describe it. Okay, so let's go over the rear bus, and in order to do that, let's look at the Men I Trust track for a video that just came out recently. So this is the actual compression that's happening on the track, but before we get into that, let me just give everyone who's unfamiliar with Ableton a quick rundown about what's happening. So if I hit the tab button, or this button in the top right, we go into the mixing panel. On here, you will see A, B, C, and D. These are the same as A, B, C, and D for return tracks. One of them is the hi-hat accent, which is just a high shelf right now. We have a parallel vocal chain, we have a reverb, and then we have the rear bus. Now remember, rear bus is letter D. If we look at the bass, a good amount of it is going into the rear bus. If we look at the keys, a good amount of it is going into the rear bus. We have one of the guitars going into the rear bus. We have the guitar solo going into the rear bus, and we have a bunch of the vocals going into the rear bus. The rear bus is a parallel chain specifically meant for non-rhythm instruments, meaning no drums, no percussion. They're not going into the rear bus, but basically every other instrument is going to this parallel chain. Here's what it sounds like with it and without it.
And just kept on going. What he saw was different. He should have gone to bed, but instead he stuck around for the moon.
And let's try it on the solo with it. It's making a huge difference for filling out the mix and adding the loudness and thickness that we need. The reason why I use a rear bus rather than doing more aggressive compression on all the actual tracks is it's a non-destructive way to add more fullness and volume and keep the natural sound of the original tracks. Okay, so let's open up the actual send and see what those meters are doing.
What he saw was different. He should have gone to bed, but instead he stuck around for the moon.
And on the solo. So we have two different compressors here. We have an 1176 emulation and we have a distressor emulation, one of which is doing about 3 or 4 decibels of reduction, one of which, the 1176, is really only cutting the peaks of the transients. So first it hits the 1176. Any odd transient that might be just overall a lot louder than the rest of the mix is chopped down to size. The distressor plugin is actually doing most of the compression in this channel. It's only about a 2-to-1 ratio. Combined, these are really only doing like a 4-to-1 ratio. It's not that aggressive. It's just kind of adding a level of loudness behind our original mix that to me sounds much more full and large. And the fact that you would ever think to put all of your harmonic instruments into a parallel send and mix that to taste, it's just a really powerful tool that I never would have thought of before. And again, because it's a parallel track, we can decide how much we do or do not want. Let's add like too much of it to see how that would sound. It's just an amazing tool to get the body that you need from what might be a thinner mix. It gives it that kind of professional vibe of having a more compressed sound without being too grating on your ears or being so overly compressed that it just hurts. All right, back to the original video. So there you go. There are 4 different mixing techniques that I don't think anyone else has ever mentioned in a YouTube video, besides maybe the rear bus. I just figured, you know, you might be bored of all the YouTube influencers telling you to sidechain your kick. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.